Okay, this video is a book review. The name of the book is A Tale of Two Cities. The author is right here, Charles Dickens. This is him as a young man. He had success as a pretty young author with his book, The Pickwick Papers. It was published in serial form, and the great thing about serial form publishing in comparison with publishing a full, completed book is that you get feedback with each month's, let's say it's put in a monthly magazine. You get feedback each month to see if the readers like what you're doing, so you can adjust it as you go. His greatest book of all time, though, was Christmas Carol. That's the greatest novel ever written, and it's real short. It's very easy to read. It's just wonderful. It's the greatest novel by any author of all time. I love that book. It's been made into a tons of movie, and it was his most popular book back in his day as well. You have the whole sense of the Victorian city environment and the way Scrooge turned himself around. Here's a nice painting of Scrooge after church, after he had become the good Scrooge. You know, the tombstones are reminders. That's a common thing, like in Ireland and England. You know, you see the tombstones of your ancestors buried out in front of the church, and that's a good reminder of something for a person to live up to. I was shown the tombstones of my ancestors, the ones in Ireland. Okay, now we're going to talk about the book A Tale of Two Cities. So here's a famous painting by Eugene Delacroix, Liberty Leading the People. And this actually fits pretty well with the whole story of the storming of the Bastille and all the other events. So the French Revolution is a very, very different thing than the American Revolution. American Revolution, for the founding of the United States, for its independence from England, is probably, you know, as Ayn Rand had said, it's the greatest founding of any country and ever in the history of the world. You had these good, brilliant men like G.W., Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, John Adams, Patrick Henry, and others that were just good. They wanted freedom, and they wanted freedom for everybody. I know there's a little more to it than that with the South, but for the time, it was a giant advance in the freedom of humans. Okay, here's some versions of the movie. This one, A Tale of Two Cities. What's nice about this movie is this is Charles Darnay, and he later falls in love and they get married with Lucy Manette. Charles Manette, though, because he had been an aristocrat in France, and after the Revolution, all the aristocrats were thrown into prison. He gets thrown into prison, and that's a big part of the story. This is his name, the actor that plays Charles Darnay. It's a magnificent movie, by the way. And like I said, you can watch this for free on the internet. Here's just a comic book cover. The last scene is very famous. There's these two guys that look alike. One is Charles Darnay here, and the other one is Sidney Carton. And it's a long story how the similarity of their appearance ends up being very important for the story. So bottom line, would I recommend you read the book? Yes. I like to read it as an audiobook in the car. You know, I'm just driving, so I got nothing else to do, and I like listening to these audiobooks. You'll get a lot of things out of it. The vocabulary is very highbrow. So here, of course, and the book starts out with her father is Dr. Manette in France, and he had been unfairly imprisoned in the Bastille for witnessing something he wasn't supposed to see, some bad behavior of aristocrats. And he spent about 16 years in the Bastille, and she thought she was like orphaned. She lost her mother, and so she was very happy to be brought back together with her father, reunited with him. Later on, her father, you know, sort of gets his wits about him better, and he speaks up to try to help and protect Darnay, who'd been unfairly imprisoned for having been an aristocrat formerly in France. And all of this stuff here, there's not a lot of physical action, but there's a tremendous amount of psychological action, and it reminds me of the quote by Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer said, "The better the book, the less physical action there will be. The more there will be internal dialogue and internal, you know, tensions about resolving issues for the individual." And he says that's what a good book is all about. And that's what an intelligent person enjoys the most when they read. Which I think is funny because if you look at modern Hollywood, it's the exact opposite. Tons of physical action and special effects, but the play is moronic, you know, something a young high school person could understand. I like these old Victorian age novels. He was the best writer of the 1800s in England, and there were a lot of very good writers in England in the 1800s, the Victorian age. And I also like him because back in those days with all those Victorian novels like Tess of the D'Urbervilles, you know, the Mayor of Casterbridge and all that stuff, Thomas Hardy and whatnot. I used to watch these BBC shows with my father. My father is, you know, grown up in Ireland, but it was a good thing for me because I always wanted to be like my dad. we would watch these BBC specials about whatever was the latest English novel being featured, and I would often try to read the books, and my dad would often be reading one of the books, and so I would talk to him about it. And at the time, I thought I was being like my dad, and I wanted to be like my father, and so that was good because it got me to read a lot. In retrospect, when I look back, I almost can't remember the books at all, which makes me think, obviously, I didn't understand them. When you're a young virgin boy, you don't understand marriage and relationships and all the other bigger issues. But I don't think it was a waste of time either. It was something that I enjoyed with my father. I developed a respect and an appreciation for it. And I think it helped me a lot in school. I had a very good vocabulary. I was just great at spelling, even though, all I had done was read these books. I didn't really like school that much, but I liked reading the books and talking with my father. And I think that gave me a good vocabulary. Okay, let's see what else about Charles Dickens. He was born in 1812, died 1870. He was truly a friend of the proles. He had grown up quite poor. His father was even put in debtor's prison. He was forced to drop out of school after, about the age of 10 years old, and he had to work in a lousy factory job, working with bootblack. It was, really a terrible job, and he saw how the poor people suffered. Later on, he got some inheritance from his grandmother, and that enabled him to go back to school for about 3 more years. He was much neglected by his parents. His father was in debtor's prison for a while. His mother was busy out of all the other children. There were 8 kids in the family, and that's partly why he often wrote about orphans, people like Oliver Twist. Oliver Twist is a great book, and that's the one where he was orphaned, his mother died, and then the famous scene is when he's at the workhouse for poor kids and orphans, and he asks for more soup, and he catches a lot of flack for that. By the way, that's a great book and a great movie, Oliver Twist. Well worth seeing. Charles Dickens, when he was young, he was a big, voracious reader. He was mostly self-educated, and he loved to read Smollett, Tobias Smollett. Tobias Smollett's a fun writer from, a couple of generations ahead of him. He did a great translation of Don Quixote, real clever, with all kinds of exaggerated, funny things. That was sort of a common thing in the late 1700s to write in England in a funny, exaggerated way. Tobias Smollett did that, and the other guy who did that was like Tristram Shandy books. I think Stern was the author of that, and that was a very clever, funny book in that same genre style. Let's see, what else about Charles Dickens? Yeah, so because he knew so much about poverty, and he also knew a tremendous amount about the legal system in England, he was able to write great dramas about everything related to those topics. He was a total workaholic. I mean, the guy was constantly writing novels in serial form, acting in plays, writing all kinds of stuff. And he married a daughter of a newspaper editor, which was kind of a good career move. For marriage, you might as well try to marry in a way that's going to make your life better. Okay, love is nice, but you should try to find a little more than just love. And by that I mean, friendship's more important for picking a spouse than love is. And by that I mean you're going to have to talk to whoever you marry for a long time. So I've seen people marry in a way that it kind of helps them. If you and your spouse both are interested in whatever it is, being writers, that's something you could always talk about. Let's see, what else? Later on, he became super sort of famous and popular for his public speaking, where he'd read his books out loud in front of audiences. And the most popular one was Christmas Carol. He had 9 kids of his own. He was real successful in his own day, a best-selling author, and made a lot of money doing that. Probably made tons of money, though, with this public speaking, which I was kind of surprised. He put a lot of drama into it. Okay, back in those days, books were real expensive, especially when he was young. They were starting to become cheaper and cheaper as he went farther along, but the books were so expensive, like in the earliest 1800s, it'd be like the equivalent of $400 a piece. And that led to people just getting books from libraries, and later again, of course, serial publication of chapters in magazines. In the libraries, they would split a novel up into like 3 parts. They'd call that a triple decker, so that way, one person could have loaned out the beginning, another the middle, and another the end. Let's see. I thought that was kind of cool how they serialized a novel, and it kind of reminded me of the difference again between a print book and internet video. They learned from the feedback, because you got to entertain the audience each month. A lot of effort went into sort of having a little cliffhanger at the end of it to get them eager to get it for the next month. And he learned from that. Like the Pickwick Paper didn't do so well at first, But then he saw when he added more jokes and puns and a comedic character, people liked that, and he did more of that with his writing. People were more literate in the 1800s than they are nowadays. There was nothing else to do. There was no TV set. There was no radio. So lots of people really enjoyed reading these books. I mean, the numbers of sales he would have for selling his books and his serial chapters in his publications were off the charts. Like people, 20 years ago would talk about the most popular TV show. They would talk about what they read from his book. So he was super famous and popular during his lifetime in England. He said that his greatest story of all time in the English language was The Prodigal Son. And that's sort of a perspective reflected in his writing, that idea of rags to riches and of, screwing up your life and trying to make up for it, and redemption was a big part of his writing. He was very English in his style and his personality, very pro-family, very much a friend of the poor. His message is very Christian. He's a very Christian writer. And if I had to say, what does he sort of encourage the person to do between the lines? All throughout his books, it's sort of like, do the right thing and hopefully things will come out well in the end. And they usually would for his major characters, but quite often not for the minor characters, certainly, setting the scene in the background. He was notable for making great names for his characters, like Stryver is the guy who wants upper mobility, Cruncher was the grave robber, and he does that over and over. His characters will have these funny names that sort of catches who they are and what they do in the book, and it's kind of reminiscent of like Homeric catchphrases, where he would, for each person or thing, there would be this characteristic thing, Dawn Rose with, red fingers, things like that of Homer, almost like a nickname or a... Okay, Christmas Carol, I think, is the greatest novel of all time. If I had to say what the greatest novels are of all time, look at how many of these books were written in the 1800s. Greatest novel of all time, in my opinion, Christmas Carol. Number 2 would be Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. Number 3, I would put it at Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. Some people will say, oh, well, what about Tolstoy? Tolstoy is not even in the same ballpark as Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky was much, much better psychological writer. He was almost like a psychologist writing and a Christian, versus Tolstoy was more like a moralistic, pain-in-the-butt rich guy who was sort of self-righteous. The more you learn about both of them, the more you're going to like Dostoevsky, the less you're going to like Tolstoy. Tolstoy has nothing to say to me. He has no message. And I actually think very much like Ayn Rand does in her book Romantic Manifesto when she describes the writers and how great they were. She doesn't mention Christmas Carol, perhaps because he's too overtly Christian, but she loved these other guys here. Okay, Animal Farm, Orwell's fantastic in 1984. Da Vinci Code, I think, by Dan Brown is one of the greatest novels of all time. And that book, there's a lot of ways you can read it, but man, the skill in writing that book was off the charts great. Even though the book had a real stupid ending, and I think Dan Brown's a big liar and all that kind of stuff, fine. It was still very entertaining. Atlas Shrugged's a masterpiece. Quo Vadis, masterpiece. My favorite book of Thomas Wolfe was Charlotte Simmons, just because it kind of reminded me. I read it when I was young, and it really related to the life of a college student. Anyways, those are some of the other books I think are the greatest of all time. We won't get into that. So, A Tale of Two Cities. What are the two cities? This is getting back to Charles Dickens' book, are London and Paris. And so London at that time was relatively stable, and the French family that had fled France, the Manette family, had a nice life there. And they were very good people. You can't help liking them, okay? Dr. Manette had been unfairly imprisoned in the Bastille when he was a young man for seeing what happened between some aristocrats that they didn't want him to see or know about or talk about. And he essentially was buried alive in the Bastille for 16 years before he was recalled to life at the beginning of the book. And his daughter, who thought she was orphaned, was so happy to be with him. And that's a nice story there. Then she falls in love with Charles Darnay, who's kind of connected to some of the wicked aristocrats in France. And that becomes relevant, the way the story connects everything. That's another thing that's brilliant about Dickens. He has a very complex plot that's well thought out. And as the story goes along, you see the connections between all the characters. And they're really good. And why do I think Dickens is worth reading? Because I think his psychological portrayals of people are accurate. And these things help you to be smarter in real life. Sidney Carton is the anti-hero hero who's a lookalike with Charles Darnay, the French aristocrat, and he does wonderful things for him. That's a beautiful thing. And Lucy Manette, she's also good and kind and smart, and she recognizes in Sidney Carton, despite all his screw-ups, he's a bit of an alcoholic and whatnot, he's a good person, and she recognizes that, and she's nice to him. So, as long as somebody you recognize their heart's in the right place. It's good to be friends with them and, not be so harsh on people just because everybody's got problems. Let's see. Madame Dufarge, she's a lady whose family had been treated very terrible by the French aristocrats, and so she had a reason to be pissed off and not like them, but she sort of turned herself into a monster, and she's kind of scary. The way she's described is extraordinarily well written, and that's a thing that a person has to be careful not to let their anger and resentment turn them into a monster, and she lost control of it. But the reason why I think it's great the way it was written was I've seen people like that. So what I really liked about this book was it all rings true in terms of how people behave and how they act and what their motives are. So I think it makes you psychologically smarter to read this book. And it's beautifully done. It's beautifully tied together. And Dickens is very highbrow vocabulary. You read books like this, you'll be way more sophisticated in your verbal skills than persons who don't read these sort of things. Okay, the French Revolution, like I said, was evil. It was sort of almost like a MARX type of revolution. It was COMM, then U, then NIST type of revolution. It was evil, the French Revolution, okay? It was evil, it was cruel, it was bad, it was atheistic. They destroyed a lot of the churches and the religious clergy and whatnot. Sort of like the more you learn about the French Revolution, the less you like it, the worse you recognize that it was. And it's quite the opposite with the American. The more that you look at the American one, the more you appreciate how great those men were. Thomas Jefferson's reading in 5 different languages, getting Bible copies for everybody, going to Bible studies all the time, trying to make everybody better off. They all tried to make everybody better off. They had to make some compromises with the South, which were unfortunate, but that was necessary in that day in order for the 13 colonies to be united. But there's really a big, big, big difference between America and France in their revolutions. Okay, so all I can say is I'll put a link below to the 1980 film that's available free on YouTube, and it's worth your time. And I liked it as an audiobook because, listening in the car, I got nothing to do, and I'm like, wow, is this good? So Charles Dickens does not disappoint. Anyways, let's see, I think I got one more slide here, one more picture. And this is just Charles Dickens in his studio. So if I had to compare like the greatest authors, Charles Dickens is a man of the people. He loves the poor. He's very Christian. He wants to do what's right. And that's not a coincidence. The 3 best writers of all time are Christian, okay? Because that mentality of thinking gets right human metaphysics and hope and the idea of failure, redemption, and sorrow and purpose in life. It just gets it better than any other metaphysical personal philosophy. Victor Hugo, the Catholic, Les Mis is an incredible, extraordinary book. But I think if I had to know them in real life, I think that Charles Dickens, I would probably like him more than I like Victor Hugo. But I think I would like Dostoevsky more than either one of them because Dostoevsky was sort of a deeper thinker. I think Dostoevsky was smarter and he was more interesting in terms of really understanding the psychological depth of humans and having a vision of the future. So, great storytellers, Charles Dickens and Victor Hugo. They're extraordinary. I mean, these are like the greatest writers of all time, but I like Dostoevsky better than those 3. Anyways, hope this YouTube channel was fun, and yes, I do think the book is surprisingly good. It's a little confusing at first, so you might want to look up who the characters are before you even start reading it, otherwise you can get confused, but I really enjoyed it, and it emotionally left a message with me, and what I liked best about it was it rings true how people behave, and the events of the French Revolution are unfortunately more similar to the events of modern life than one would wish. So, be that as it may, I think it's a very good book.